afternoon. Good afternoon. My name's Jasmine Burns, and I'm on the board for the Charleston Literary Festival. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the Charleston READS session. Charleston READS is a collaboration between the Mayor's Book Club, Oakwood University, a historical Black university in Huntsville, Alabama, and the Charleston Literary Festival. This year, the city was invited to read the original Black elite, Daniel Murray and the Story of a Forgotten Era, written by Dr. Elizabeth Dowling Taylor. This book chronicles the life of Daniel Murray, a pioneering Black civic leader and assistant librarian at the Library of Congress. His story is reflective of the rise and fall of America's high-achieving Black elite as a result of systemic racism from emancipation to Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era. The distinguished speakers for this session are Dr. Elizabeth Dowling Taylor and Dr. Kim Long. Dr. Elizabeth Dowling Taylor is an independent scholar and lecturer who received her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Her career spans with over 22 years of museum education and historical research. She previously held the position of Director of Interpretation at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and Director of Education at James Madison's Montpelier. Most recently, she was a fellow at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities in Charlottesville, Virginia. She is the author of one prior book titled A Slave in the White House, Paul Jennings and the Madisons. It was a New York Times best-selling book and a National Book Award nominee. Joining Dr. Elizabeth Dowling Taylor in conversation is Dr. Kim Long. Dr. Long's undergraduate alma mater is Oakwood University. She holds advanced degrees in education, organizational leadership, and early childhood public policy. She is the executive director of the Lowcountry Rice Culture Project and is also a board member for the Charleston Literary Festival. Dr. Long has also been closely associated with the Charleston READS Project from its inception. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Dowling Taylor and Dr. Kim Long.
Well, Beth, I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you because it's been long anticipated. And I'm just so in awe of your exceptional research skills. And I want to give you some time to introduce your book to the audience.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for me to get to know you recently. I feel like we're already close with each other. And I can assure you that my work on this book was a great labor of love. My book is a biography of Daniel Murray, who was an assistant librarian of Congress at a time where such appointments for Black men were rare. Daniel Murray was a pioneer in the Black history movement, a major race activist, a model civic citizen, and a leading member of Washington, D.C.'s Black elite. But his story and his family's story is couched in a larger narrative, and that is the remarkable rise and disastrous decline of African American prospects traced over Murray's lifetime. He was born free in 1851, and he died in 1925. Now, after emancipation, there was, to quote one ex-slave, a glorious harvest of good things. Most notably, the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, what we call the Reconstruction Amendments, that granted to all Americans of any color every right of citizenship, including the vote. I'm talking about the period between 1865 and 1875, let's say. But later, the federal government turned their backs on those Reconstruction commitments, and they did so in order to reunite with the former Confederate states, and did it, again, on the black man's back. So during what we call the Jim Crow period, blacks in the South were virtually re-enslaved. They were stigmatized, segregated, discriminated against, humiliated, and subject to terror as extreme as lynching. Now, because of my career arc and because of my own special interest, I had long been a student of the slavery period, and I understood how central it was to understanding American history, but I was a little bit slower in appreciating that the period between emancipation and the modern civil rights movement is just as central. And as evidence of my own ignorance, because you say a lot of Americans, you bring up the word Reconstruction, and they're not sure. Was that a good thing or was that a bad thing? And my own experience shows my initial ignorance before I undertook an intensive study. And I had in my head an image of African American legislators in the halls of Congress looking like buffoonish rubes with hayseeds in their mouths. And it was a very clear picture in my head. Well, as part of my research for this book, I thought I should watch the original 1915 movie by D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation. And I knew it would be the second time I was watching it, that I had watched it in a humanities class in high school. And although it floors me to think of it, I cannot recall that there was any discussion of the content, that it was about studying the innovative film techniques of Griffith's. So this time I'm watching it, and with great difficulty, I had to keep taking breaks. It was just that horrible. But then there's a screenshot, and it's like, that's it. That's the picture in my head. An African American in the legislative chamber. He had bare feet. His feet were up on the desk and loomed enormous in close-up. And behind him was his colleague gnawing on a chicken bone. That's the picture. That's where that came from. And it shows you how influential public culture is, and especially visual images. Now, that film captivated the American public and put in their heads all kinds of false images that were not countered by our schooling, as inaccurate as it was. Now, to be sure, there were 23 African American gentlemen who served in the federal Congress and Senate, and who did so with distinction. And yes, Reconstruction was a good thing. It ended prematurely. It ended too early. And Jim Crow was the bad thing. We have to recognize all of our history, own all of our history. And only then can our solutions to the legacies be better considered. We need to have the full picture because it will make the solutions more understandable, more meaningful. Now, in writing this book, it's always been my feeling that history, which is so important, goes down easier if it's personalized. So I combined biography with history. And I chose Daniel Murray as the focus, as the main character, because I admired him, and because, as it turned out, and even more so than I initially recognized, his personal story, his arc, fit the larger arc almost perfectly. Now, why did I focus on the Black elite? Because that was a major reason I wrote this book. I wanted, number one, to underscore the heterogeneity of the African American experience. 42 million Americans do not form a monolithic group. And we know that today, African Americans are not a homogeneous block, but what a lot of people don't appreciate is that they were not either as early as before the Civil War. And the other reason I chose the Black elite is because they put in highest relief the absurdity of the notion of white supremacy. These individuals were not works in progress. They had achieved high levels of education, accomplishment, gentility. They were prosperous. They were lawyers. They were doctors. They were businessmen, entrepreneurs. So they gave the lie to the idea that blacks could not be full and contributing members of the society. Many of them, again, Washington was the mecca for the Black elite, and many of them came there to begin with, if they weren't natives of that city, to become clerks or much higher positions in the district government or in the federal government. And I'm talking all the way up to the Register of the Treasury. Blanche Bruce, his name, his signature was on every item of American currency. Well, the Black elite were ready, right on the cusp, ready to think of themselves as Americans first, people of color second, with no apology for color. And so the logical next step would be assimilation into mainstream society, if there was to be one society. But that was not to be, not yet. When the rug was pulled out from under all African Americans because the federal government turned their backs on the promises made and guaranteed in that Constitution, the Black elite were not to be considered, as it turned out, exceptions. They only had further to fall. W.E. Du Bois said the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Dear interlocutor, I'm ready for you.
Okay, wonderful. Wonderful, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. And I have to talk about, we've talked about this because when we talked first on the telephone, you said, well, how did you find me? How did you find the book? Well, it was researching an exhibit that's over at the Gilliard Performing Arts Center now, at Mary Church Terrell and the Traveling Griots, Lifting as We Climb. And so as I was researching those women, they kept reoccurring in this book. And can we spend some time talking about why you featured the women so often in the book.
I'd love to. You know, one of the reasons that Daniel Murray turned out to be a good choice for me, and I did not know this at all when I started, because I knew him through his work for the Library of Congress, and especially as a pioneer in the Black History movement. But it turned out that his wife, Anna Evans, also part of the Black elite. Let me say a little bit about Anna before I describe her race activism. She was from the abolitionist town of Oberlin, Ohio. She went to Oberlin College, as did Mary Terrell, and as did so many men and women that were part of the Black elite. It was a connection, like when her family moved to Washington, for her to just say, I'm from Oberlin. Oh, she would discover many others in the Black elite that were from Oberlin. The Black elite, make no mistake about it, was very exclusive, almost snobbish. You couldn't just say, well, gee, I think I'd like to be part of that group. And certainly, most were light-skinned. Most had money. But neither one of those, or even the two together, would be enough to meld in. What was more important was the question, who are your family? Who are your people? Why are you in Washington? Did you come to accept an appointment in the government, or are you highly educated? Do you have in your background, in your family background, Civil War heroes or major abolitionists? Well, Anna Murray had, especially the latter, in abundance. And so when she, in Washington, married Daniel Murray, she was a good catch for him and furthered him and them as a couple in this exclusive club. Now, Murray's idea was that he's a scholar, and he believed in the idea that scholarship, as W.E. Du Bois and many others did, scholarship can be put to the cause of Negro protest. And he said that the true test of the progress of a people is their literature. Now his wife, they were a power couple, like Mary Church Terrell and Robert Terrell. They were a real power couple, and he supported her in all that she did. And her idea, and I know you relate to this, Kim,
Yes.
is that her cause, which more and more she identified as a race issue, was early childhood intervention. If young children could not be brought up in homes like the Black elite had, where they were highly cultivated, then the next best thing would be the kindergarten. And Anna introduced, she is the mother of public kindergartens in Washington, D.C. I'm talking about for both Black and white children. And then more and more as time went by, she became a notable race speaker across the country. She was a remarkable woman. They had 7 children. She was very, very busy as a homemaker, but they were involved in so many issues. Yes, with special attention to race issues, but not only that, they were model civic citizens. That's so admirable.
Yes. Well, and you touched on this before, but I want to revisit it. When you say the Black community, you wanted to describe the variabilities of the Black community. Can you give some
Well,
more
it's always,
information?
for a long time, I just cringe when I hear it. It's a pet peeve of mine when people say, the Black community. Again, we're talking about 42 million Americans. There's no such thing as, no more than it'd make any sense to you to hear the white community. You wouldn't expect to hear that phrase. It wouldn't make any sense to hear it. Well, it doesn't make any more sense for Black Americans. Kim and I were talking about nomenclature is always a big issue. If I need to ask for forgiveness, I do, but because of my research, I certainly might use words like colored or Negro, and that's okay with me anyway, because it's, these are historical. And But one word I hate to use, I will use it because I don't have a good substitute, but that is the word race. Speaking biologically, there is one race, the human race.
Yes.
And here's the kicker. We are all descendants of Africa, every last human being, if you go back far enough. So, you know, sometimes I just feel like saying, let's cut the crap.
Yes. Well, and also the slogan that was developed during that time period by the women,
Yeah.
primarily, lifting as we climb. Let's talk about
Well,
that.
it's a great slogan. Now, this is the, you know, those days people were joiners, and there were all sorts of clubs for various common interests, including those related to race, but far from only that. And in Washington, Anna was very involved with several organizations, including the one that Mary Church Terrell became the first president of, and that was the National Association for Colored Women. And their slogan was, lifting as we climb. And there's so much packed into that, you know. Anna Murray, she said that those in the black elite, and speaking of women in particular, were like leaven through which their less fortunate sisters would rise. So that's a beautiful metaphor. And one thing I do want to stress about the black elite is that, with very few exceptions, they cared very much about the mass of black people, not just their own special club, you know. And they understood that, but they had to understand more and more as time went by, we're connected with their fate. You know, it's not, we're this offshoot, and then there's the blacks at large. Because of the reversal, they more and more had to say, wow, we're connected. If the power structure won't recognize us as different, then we're connected. And from the beginning, they thought of themselves as a bridge or brokers between white society and the larger black masses. And that by their very example, they were making progress and helping whites to feel more comfortable with blacks. And whites did feel more comfortable with blacks that were more light-skinned, had more European features, talked proper English, and during the period of the rise, they were happy in Washington to interact with them in business, let's say in education, even if they would draw the line, for the most part, but not totally, at social interaction. Now, one thing else you have to understand is that, you know, sometimes they would get they'd get criticized by the whites, they'd get criticized by the lower class blacks, you know. You don't care about us, you claim prejudice from whites, but you have color prejudice, and you know, you wish you were white, you want to run away from your race. That could not have been further from the truth. If you want to run away from your race and you can pull it off, well, you do it. These people didn't do it. They didn't want to do it. They identified wholeheartedly with their color and with their backgrounds, light-skinned as they might be, and they did favor that, and you can tell that by mate selection alone. You know, Murray had one friend who was so light-skinned, and he said, my problem is I've been trying my entire life to pass for colored. And I always think of Walter White, and no, I don't mean the character from Breaking Bad. The other Walter White, the one who was the executive secretary of the NAACP for so long. It's so interesting to think about the fact that he was one 64th black. Golden hair, blue eyes. But you know, if a man wants to identify as a race man, which he did, you know, then that's that, and you can't keep him down. And that's, you know, in Murray's generation, that's how they were. Now, sad to say, when things got worse, in almost all of these black elite families, they would have children or maybe grandchildren who passed for white and had to take on that burden because, you know, part of this whole thing, that whole thing is about rise and reversal. And there's so many cases where a lot of us don't really appreciate. Like if I told you that Murray's sons went to Harvard and Cornell, all of them got college educations, you say, oh, I didn't know black people so easily could go to Harvard or Cornell at that time. Yeah, they could. And that's the thing. Everything was trending in the right direction. And so it was the generation after where they said, what? Black and white in the same dormitory or on the same sports team? Absolutely not. That's what this is so fascinating, and I just think there are a lot of aspects to it, and especially to understand everything that happened that was so positive in the rise that only made the fall sadder.
Yes. So, your story on Daniel Murray, of course, is central to Washington, D.C., but their interactions, their network, was throughout the country, especially up and down the Atlantic seaboard. Let's spend some time on that because there were many that came from Charleston and traveled between Charleston and D.C. or that were born in Charleston that ended in D.C.
To be part of the black elite was to be part of a network. And by the way, not every well-to-do black individual cared about being part of the black elite. You had to want to be part of the social world to be part of that. And not everybody's into that. But there were enclaves of black elites in Charleston, Atlanta, Memphis, Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. And they all knew each other. And one of the reasons that Washington was the Mecca, without a doubt, is because of the federal government. Right. And for a while, they called it a colored man's paradise. And blacks could think of the federal government as their protectors, the ones who passed those amendments to the Constitution. But as time went by, one thing that was so important to them, as times went by and the decline came in, they found themselves losing ground, being humiliated, being disrespected on a daily basis. So one of the reasons they were so close among themselves is that they wanted to escape everything Jim Crow. And you have to remember that the time we're talking about was before the automobile. Black elites traveled. They traveled by train. And one of the issues that got under their skin really bad were the Jim Crow cars. They'd buy a first-class ticket, and then depending on what state they were in, now in Washington, you could buy a first-class ticket, you get in the first-class car, but the minute you get into Virginia, you change position. And the humiliation alone, I mean, the black elite would often say, okay, let's focus on class. Let's focus on respectability. Yeah, I can see why you don't want some shabbily dressed person to walk into a nice restaurant, but that should be black or white. Let's concentrate on class, So the Jim Crow cars really got to them. And the other thing is, because they, being rebuffed, going up to a hotel counter or even a movie theater and being rebuffed, especially when you have that kind of refinement, What happened was when they traveled, they would stay in each other's homes. And they did that to avoid having to well, first of all, you have to find out, well, where's the hotels where black people can stay, And so they would just try to skip all that by staying in each other's homes. So it was absolutely a true network.
And would you say it was an international network as well? When you look at...
I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. Now, if I start thinking about Europe, what I think about, and it's very sad, is the idea that there were many in the black elite who found out that they were better treated in Europe than in their native country. And furthermore, that immigrants, new people, would come to America and they would be better treated than African Americans on their native soil. And when I say on their native soil, and something that's always just really hit a chord with me, is you're talking deep roots. I mean, you can't get much more American than the deep roots that almost all African Americans, have. So when it comes to, this idea of some people being more American than others, okay, well, don't say black, because you just don't get deeper,
So Daniel Murray and his cohorts had to deal with that decline in their social status in the U.S. And so talk about how, especially Daniel, because he had some serious blows in his decline with his profession and other.
Well, so I want to talk about two things. One is how he was affected, and then also what he and his cohorts did about it, organizing. Not waiting around for white largesse, but doing something about it, decade after decade. But to start with his own decline, and it's so important anyway, because Murray, really, first and foremost, Murray is known. He's not a household name by any means, but you bring his name up at the Library of Congress, and they'll certainly tell you about him. Because he's, for one thing, the father of Negro bibliography. He started out by putting together a list of 270 titles by African American authors, and this was his lifelong obsession. And before he was done, which was right up before his death, he went from the idea of a booklet to a 6-volume encyclopedia, 800 pages each. Murray's historical and biographical history of the colored race throughout the world. First it was African American authors, then eventually it became to be any field of endeavor, and not just African American, but as he put it, people of African descent throughout the world. And he never found a publisher because there was nobody to underwrite such a 6-volume encyclopedia. It was his life's work, and first of all, he just kept working on it. You got to birth the baby at some point, but then when he tried to do that, he couldn't find a publisher. But he did find regular promotions. I mean, he started out as a laborer, but he became, in not too many years after that, an assistant librarian of Congress. And the Librarian of Congress had really taken him under his wing. And this is Ainsworth Spofford. And he was the one, the Library of Congress was in the Capitol until 1897. Started there, started with the Congress, really. But Ainsworth Spofford was the one who said, the books are, they're tottering heaps of books. We got to have a whole new building dedicated to the Library of Congress, and that means a great increase in staff and a true organizational flow chart. And so when he came up with the first one, he made Murray the head of the periodicals department. And he had given him regular raises along the way. And this was like really exciting. He was so proud. And it only lasted a few months because, as it turned out, Spofford, they got a new Librarian of Congress over Spofford. And so he couldn't support Murray in that position. And the new Librarian of Congress reorganized everyone and demoted Murray from being head of this department. And they sent his salary flying back, not to what he had been making before the new title and increase, but to what he'd been making like a decade earlier. And he worked for 25 more years at the Library of Congress without getting another raise. Now, what was the problem with him being head of periodicals? I tell you what, white men had to report to him, and that was a problem. And so they said to him in so many words that they were demoting him because of, friction due to the incident of caste. And so that was a really sad reversal. Now, for the other part of the question, I doubt there are many people in here. If I say Niagara Movement, you're with me. If I say NAACP, of course you're with me. But I don't know how many people in here have heard of the National Afro-American Council, the NAAC. But it was, in fact, the first truly national civil rights organization in the United States, founded in 1898. And Murray was part of the first executive committee, and indeed, he was the chief of their legal and legislative bureau. They fought anti-Jim Crow. They fought anti-lynching. And historians will tell you that they lasted a lot longer and had a much higher membership than the Niagara Movement ever had. And as far as the NAACP, when they formed and they wrote out their objectives, their strategies, and so on, that came directly from this earlier organization, with the most notable technique being the idea that we're going to fight it out in the courts. And specifically, you know, what the Southern governments did was so underhanded. I mean, the United States Constitution, that's supposed to be the super law of the land. But these Southern state governments rewrote their state constitutions to get around that, and sometimes in really slimy ways, like the grandfather clause in the Louisiana state constitution. That said, you have to pass a literacy test and a property test. But if your father could vote before the Civil War ended, or any of your ancestors, your father, your grandfather, you're grandfathered out of that requirement. So it's like, you know, wow, that's a pretty obvious way to, you know, disenfranchise Black Americans. And before that happened, before they did that, they were voting left and right. You know, you would get like 80% of a Black population voting, and that's how these African-American gentlemen got into the Congress and got into the Senate. And it was how they got out when these state constitutions were rewritten.
Mm-hmm. So, because I'm looking for time soon, but talk about, if you want people to take lessons away from your book, what are the lessons?
I do. I do. I mean, here's the thing is, it was pretty clear as I wrote this book that this was a cautionary tale for every American. And, you know, I think that we like to delude ourselves into thinking that there's this major American narrative. And it says that however slow, we're always moving towards increased freedom. The story I just relayed to you it's up, down, and a long struggle to get back up again. And so, no, it's not unidirectional. It can go backwards. It went backwards then, it can go backwards anytime now. And the fact is, at least for my thinking, I could name about 5 areas where it is going backwards. So the bottom line is that rights won must be rights guarded. And if not, they have to be re-won. And among the subjects I could name, and I don't want to get into all of them because I know not everybody thinks like I do, and maybe everybody doesn't think like I do on this issue either, but I am aghast at this idea of going backwards on teaching American history. You know, there's a bottom line to that, and the bottom line can be summed up in one word: truth. That's all you have to, you know, that's really all you have to know.
Well, one thing I want to stop and do, as this is a Mayor's Book Club, Charleston READS selection, I would like to recognize our mayor, Mayor John Tecklenburg. Please stand, who's here in the audience. Well, yes, we are going to have time for questions. And would you like to start the questions, Mayor Tecklenburg?
Testing. There's a lot of really characters that came out of Charleston with fascinating stories. But I got to tell y'all, I believe one of the most fascinating stories is that of Archibald Grimke. Could you elaborate on his role at this time and with the black elite in Washington, D.C.?
Sure. Archibald and his brother Francis Grimke, they were 2 major members of the black elite. And in many ways, you know, you ask the question, okay, well, how do you get into the black elite? And the original black elite, how'd they get in there? And in a lot of cases, very similar to these brothers, it's because they had a certain leg up. They were free before the Civil War, and in the case with these brothers, their white father, and this was unusual, acknowledged his paternity and got those sons educated. And then they were later aided in a positive way by 2 white half-aunts who helped them in their education, and they went to top colleges. Francis Grimke, he got his divinity degree from Princeton University. And I think Lincoln University is where Archibald went. Now, Archibald got established in Boston, where he was a lawyer. And Francis was a reverend of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, where, by the way, Daniel and Anna Murray married. And it was a major, you know, there were several black elite churches in Washington, but that was sort of the first among equals. And Francis was the reverend there. And they were very involved in all these early civil rights organizations that I'm talking about. But you know, the idea of having a leg up, it meant that you were free for longer, that you had an education, and in many cases, including Murray, you know, there are some families, I don't know if you'll know a lot of these names like Cook and Brent and Wormley and Francis as the last name. They were people that were free in Washington for a long time, and even Daniel Murray got there early enough because he was born in Baltimore, that what they did, they bought land. And they bought land in what at the time seemed like the outskirts of Washington, but that became prime city real estate. And many in the black elite, they had a second stream of income. Murray could never have made it on his salary from the Library of Congress. He was a business entrepreneur. He dabbled in real estate, he was savvy about stocks and bonds, and he ended up being like a major landowner, and that's how he got rich. But yeah, the Grimkes are a fascinating family in every way. I haven't read it, but I know there's a new book out on them. Thank you. And thank you for being here, Mayor. And thank you for Charleston Reads. I'm so flattered.
Yes. Okay, are there any more questions? We're going to have questions now. I see a question over here, Sterling, or I know you're, I don't. Okay, and there are others in this area.
Thank you. I was absolutely fascinated with Anne Murray's but her work beginning the kindergarten, being the mother of the kindergarten. Not only did she start the kindergarten, but she had the feeding programs, clothing programs for the students and such, and in some cases housed some of the students. And I could almost draw a dotted line to modern day Black Panther movement, where they did the same thing.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
They
right.
fed, they clothed,
yeah,
they educated. Did you draw that dotted line?
I
to
did not,
Black
thank
Panthers?
you, Beverly. I did not draw that line, but I hear you. And, as busy a woman as she was, she always had time to open up her house when there'd be one of these conferences in Washington, and they did often meet in Washington. She would allow her house to be like the orientation center. And also I was thinking about something Mary Church Terrell said, which certainly Anna believed too. Like what Mary Church Terrell said is, we're going to find the solution in the children. You know, they're not tainted yet. So we're going to, whether it be, and the mothers who teach those children, whether it be, Black children or white children. And, even as I say those words, I think about how even that is easier said than done. It ought to work, but, it gets complicated because of our long history being what it was. But yeah, young people, always the new generation.
Is Pauli Murray related?
Oh, Pauli Murray.
Pauli Murray.
Did you get that book I
She's
told
one
you
of my
about?
did.
favorites
I
of all
bought
time.
it right away.
Well, I was, before I ever began this book, I read Pauli Murray's Proud Shoes, and I thought, I love a good memoir, and this is such a good memoir. And of course, naturally, I thought right away about, could she be related to Daniel Murray? Well, the short answer is no, and in fact, her carrying the Murray name came from some kind of stepfather or grandfather or something like that. So no, I wish there was. That would be. And if y'all don't know Pauli Murray, buy that book, Proud Shoes. And she was a fascinating woman, very much ahead of her time in some ways. She went to Howard, and people think of all the lunch counter business in the South, but she was one of the activists in doing that same kind of thing in D.C. I can't tell you, my talk's not about Pauli Murray, so I can't tell you a whole lot more about it, but I don't think you'll regret it if you read that book.
Good evening. I'm Benson Prigg from Oakwood University, chair of the Department of English and Spanish. I really want to thank you for this book. When I first got it, I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, because I'm not into elitism. So I said, let me go ahead and get into this. It's a very rich text, very rich text. My observation, and then I'll give you my question, is I like the way that you dealt with the political relationship regarding the blacks and Republicans, and how that began to actually shift at some point. Just to remind us that it wasn't about Republican or Democrats, it was what was best for the black people, even though they didn't have to even though they could not always depend on those political leaders. This book, I would say, is a book that I would put on the list of woke texts. And I'm wondering, how have you been woke from the experience? Now, you mentioned some things, but I'd like to know how it's continued to wake you up, if you will. And then also, has this book gotten the badge of being on the woke list of books? And when do you hope it gets there? And what kind of resistance has it received already?
Well, my son is here tonight. I'm so happy to have him here. And I remember talking with him about issues, and I told him that when I was a young person, the phrase that we used was, "My consciousness has been raised." And he said, "Oh yeah, that's what we call woke now." But the word is being mocked in an exaggerated and unfair way. So, it's almost like, okay, now let's find another word. I can't say I've received, on either of my books, both on African American history, I can't say that I've received much blowback, but that's partly because of the kind of people I hang out with, and you often find yourself teaching to the choir, as they say. It's just, I've considered a legacy from my mother, my deep interest in troubled race relations in America. It's just been something that I've always cared about, and it was my good fortune when I got my job at Monticello as head of the guides and training the guides and all that. It just happened that the time was now for lots of staff members saying, we need to tell a truer and fuller story here about the African American heritage at this presidential plantation. And it made me feel good to be part of that and to feel like it was, and then I had the same opportunity at Montpelier. And it made me feel good, as I did in writing these books and getting good feedback, especially what I've gotten from you all in Charleston. Kim's got my head this big, now, telling me how, wonderful this book was. So for me, it just makes me feel good that I've had the opportunity to make a small contribution to something I care so much about.
Would you comment on the role of President Woodrow Wilson?
Oh, thank you.
In the period of reversal?
Yeah. Okay, so historians will tell you that in the early 20th century, and they're hesitant about naming an exact date or even decade, but they talk about the nadir, the point at which prospects for African Americans were the lowest and even the most dangerous, because one of the ways you define it is by the amount of lynching that's going on. Okay, so I know most of you know that what Beverly was saying, and Daniel Murray, this is a recurring theme, but the idea of saying, oh, black people are in the pocket of one party or the other. And at this point, it was the Republican Party that was the black man's party. And Murray was like, oh, we just, that's so frustrating that they always count on our vote. They don't think they have to win our vote. They just, count on it. And yet, when the Democrat Woodrow Wilson came to the fore, and he talked W.E.B. Du Bois into believing he'd be fair to the black men, and Du Bois always felt tricked by him. Woodrow Wilson was Southern bred, and so were many of the members of his cabinet. And this is, the open, rabid kind of racism. And when he became president, he thought that blacks and white needed to be segregated. Why? His reason was always so pathetic, to avoid friction, you know. So he did just that. And in Washington, at work, blacks had to work in a screened off area. They had to use separate restrooms. They'd have a sequestered area in the lunchroom. And sad to say, this went down for Murray at the Library of Congress. He comes to work one day and they say, oh no, don't put your jacket there. We've got a separate cloakroom for black employees. And you know, he'd been used to interaction. He could no longer use the public cafeteria, nor could visiting blacks, so it's not really a public cafeteria. And in the lunchroom for the employees, again, you know, there was a segregated area. Now and this was, you know, at this point the NAACP is in full action, and they reacted immediately. James Monroe Trotter, W.E.B. Du Bois, they went right up to Woodrow Wilson, and they fought against this. And in this case, because of their fighting against it, though it went, took a good while to kind of go away, it was never codified by law. It was just Wilson and his cabinet, you know, speaking out. So that's the good news part of it. But yeah, the neighbor.
The boss lady has spoken. So, but what I want to do is take a moment and ask, we have Oakwood University students here, communication students. Please stand, Oakwood University. Thank you. Thank you. And we have the president and first lady of Oakwood University. Please stand. Dr. Pollard. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. This was a wonderful conversation that I hope you all enjoyed. And it certainly was our pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much.